The light come on?
How you doing?
You're right on time.
I'm not often, very, very, very,
Yep.
very rare.
When that light there comes on, we're good. Thank you.
How you doing, Roger? Nice to meet you. Well, good evening, everyone. We'll go ahead and start the meeting. It's now 6 o'clock. The first item on the agenda is to approve the minutes held from the January 23rd meeting.
I'll make a motion, we approve the January 23rd minutes.
I'll second.
Move second, all in favor? Good. Next item on the list, we have some gentlemen here to help us out with the understanding of the budget this year. We have Mr. Henry Beck, and Mr. Roger Cates, and Mr. Bob Nutting. Thank you for coming.
This meeting began with a request from Senator Cates' office to come and speak with the council. And as we were having that discussion, there was a lot of news being made from the governor's office on different things that would have effect on our budget process, which is also just getting underway. So in conversation with Senator Cates, we thought if we invited the full legislative delegation, Representative Beck and Representative Nutting here tonight, we could have a good exchange on what might be known to us as we begin our deliberation, which for the legislators here in the room, we've had 2 review meetings of the proposal that staff has put together. We're on a time frame that ends at town meeting in May 7th, but all our preliminary discussions are ongoing. So whatever you can tell us from Augusta would help us. There is a paper here in the seats that we've put out that is our estimate of the effects as we interpret what we've read on the Oakland budget. The $318,900 represents about 8% of our revenues. And in truth, I think Oakland is maybe being impacted a little less severely than some of the other towns we're reading about, but it is still a substantial effect. This number, if it turned out to be correct, represents about 0.6 of a mil on our mill rate. And we're trying very hard to present the budget to town meeting this year in May with a no increase in our mill rate to try and be in keeping with what we think we heard from residents at last year's town meeting. So anything that you can help us with to guide our decisions. I've read that Senator Cates has a bill in the legislature that would put revenue sharing back to the number that it was before reductions were made in the last several years. So anything you can tell us about the prospects for that legislation would be useful to us, because we're trying to pick a number between $0 and $500,000, and that's a range that's not comfortable for us. Also, by way of introduction, I'd just like to mention that Dave Terabasi is here. He's our student intern from Thomas College. He's been attending all of our meetings, learning about the governmental process, and we're happy that he can be with us tonight. Back to your right, Senator.
Thank you.
And with that, I turn it over, I think, for questions and answers. We've got a few prepared questions, but maybe once the discussion gets going, we won't need them.
Well, the senator seems to want me to start. I'm not sure if that's good or bad, but obviously the most troubling part of the budget to many of us is the revenue sharing piece. Everybody has a community or city or town that has revenue sharing and has come to depend on it. And different towns operate on tight budgets or not so tight budgets, and I would submit that Oakland has a pretty tight budget from my experience. So there are some towns maybe that can stand a little pain in the revenue sharing, and others that really cannot without cutting vital services. I think the biggest problem you have, frankly, is that we probably won't have a budget that's locked up solid until the end of May or even into the beginning of June. Our session ends June
18th or 13th.
Yeah, middle of June. So I know it must be almost impossible for you to have scenarios. My guess is that there will be some cut in revenue sharing This is just my guess. Everybody can have their own guess. I think there will be some cut, but I don't think it will be to the extent that the governor wants it. There are very few places to go in the budget where the governor can find a bunch of money. If we wanted to replace revenue sharing, make it whole, what it's been, the two big items in the budget are health and human services and education. And he doesn't want to go to, I'm speaking as if I know this for a fact, but from what I know of the governor, he doesn't want to go to education to get the money. And he would prefer to go to health and human services and the Medicaid program. Although the Medicaid program is hard to go to because there are differing points of view, different people on different sides of the aisle have honest opinions about what Medicaid should involve. And at the same time, the federal government restricts what we can do, what we can change in the Medicaid program. They basically tell us what we need to do, and it's not a program where if you come in and sign up for Medicaid and we've spent all our money, that we can say to you, I'm sorry, we don't have any more money. If you qualify, you get the money. So it makes it very hard for the governor to do that. So I think the big problem you have is working around the budget where you want to go to town meeting in May for a budget that I don't think you'll know the real number until the end of May, middle of June. And my prediction would be that there's going to be some pain in revenue sharing, but that it's not going to be nearly as dramatic as the governor has outlined in his budget. I think I'll stop there. I'm happy to answer questions after the other guys do.
Sure, well thanks for having us. It's good to have a two-way communication about the budget. First of all, I mean, the governor's budget reflects his proposals, his values, not ours, certainly not mine. Most concerned, obviously, about revenue sharing. I think there's a $400 million cut in revenue sharing. I'm glad to know your share that you would have on the chopping block. Bob talked about the places we can go and look in the budget and look for money. HHS is big, education is big, but I think we also have to look at the fact that, and it was a package that the three of us voted for, part of the structural gap is $436 million in an income tax package, much of which hasn't taken effect yet. So you have my commitment, my opinion that the majority will look at that tax cut package and what it means and how it affects towns and then of course property taxpayers. Peter mentioned, it's your policy goal not to see a mill rate increase. I share that because property taxes are, they're the most regressive in some ways. They're least based on the ability to pay, unlike income taxes. Same is true for sales taxes. So we're going to look everywhere, be creative, and look at the tax cut package, especially when we think how it will affect towns and cities.
Again, thanks for having us. And I think we're here because we wanted so much to talk to you. We wanted to hear from you about guidance for us. But let me just go back to revenue sharing for a second, because it's something I feel fairly strongly about because I was mayor in Augusta for 4 years and saw the impact it had on us. And I think it's important to go back and look historically at the genesis of revenue sharing in the first place. My wife's from Maryland, and down there most services are provided by the county, police, fire, schools, and whatever. But here in Maine, the way we're set up, local towns and cities like Oakland, like Augusta, are required to do a lot more things. We do police, we do fire, we do schools, and on and on. And yet we only have one source of revenue to do that, and that is the property tax. Get a little excise tax money, but not much. And so the deal was struck, I think, that okay, the state's more effective at collecting money through the income tax and the sales tax, but we will return 5% by statute, 5% of that money every year to the towns and cities to help us all at the local level provide all those services we have to provide. And it's a percentage, and so in good times, towns and cities get more, and bad times get less. But that was the deal. And a couple of legislatures ago, I think, and that money is not an appropriation by the legislature in the general fund. It's diverted to that into a trust before the appropriations committee even decides how to spend all the money that 5% goes over here. A couple of terms ago, the legislature took some of that money and stuck it into the general fund. And last time, we did the same thing, we took some more. So that 5% that we're supposed to be funding is now down to 3.6%. Before the governor's budget came out, I put a bill, and I didn't know the governor was gonna propose this, to ramp up over 3 years back to the 5%, because I just think that's the deal, and I think it's a good deal. I think it's the way we ought to be doing things. The governor's budget has, we have a huge hole in the budget. It's due to a variety of things. It's not the governor's fault, it's not the Democrats' fault, it's not the Republicans' fault. We're getting less federal money in, among other things, from Washington. The stimulus money dried up. We're getting hundreds of $millions for less in Maine Care, from in Medicaid funds from the federal government, and yet the costs of Maine Care are at least the same, so that means the state share has to go way up. So the governor's proposal is to eliminate revenue sharing for 2 years and make these other changes. And there's been a lot of pushback. I mean, I was in Sydney last night, I was in Augusta City Council last week, and I suspect your reaction is going to be very similar to what I heard at those two towns. So, but that's not the end of the discussion, because as Bob and Henry have both said, the budget problem isn't going away. So if we don't do this, we've got to do something. And there are a number of choices, as both of them have said. One of them is to, someone asked, I can't remember who the bank robber is, why he robbed banks, and he says that, well, that's where the money is. Well, the money in state government is 85% in human services and education. So we can talk about cuts in inland fisheries and wildlife and marine resources and all the rest, but that's the money is in education and human services. So we could make further cuts in human services. We could cut general purpose aid to schools. Those are two things we could do, rather than do this. We can look for other ways to cut spending, but to say we'll cut the fat out of state government, I think if Governor LePage isn't suggesting there's a great deal of that to be done this year, then I trust, I think we can all agree that we can trust Governor LePage to go after fat in the state government if he thinks there's a lot there to be done, and he's not proposing a great deal of that. He proposed cutting 200 jobs, but that was about it. So then, as Henry said, options, and I'm not suggesting these are good options, options are to delay the income tax cuts we made last year. There are all sorts of reasons you don't want to do that. We're very heavily taxed in Maine. It makes us uncompetitive with other states. I think we all voted for the income tax cuts for good reasons, because we thought it would help us in the long run become more competitive. We could delay those. We could delay the estate tax changes we made. We could go to look to the sales tax for an increase. Again, I'm not advocating for any of these, I'm just thinking of choices. We could increase the meals and lodging tax. So that's sort of a menu. And then I sort of run out of ideas about what we do, because I'm not sure what other big sources of solutions there are. So anyhow, that's the position we find ourselves in. And part of the problem, Peter, and every town and city going through the same thing, I don't know how you guys are expected to budget given the uncertainty about what's going on, and I don't know how you're gonna do it. But it isn't gonna get decided for a while. We haven't even begun to discuss it yet, because the reason I'm still all dressed up, because I just came from the legislature, the Appropriations Committee is just voting out the supplemental budget now, and they can't even begin to talk about this subject until we get that done next week in the legislature. So it's gonna be a while, but I think we need to hear from you as to, do you like the governor's proposal? I think I know the answer to that. If you don't like it, though, what other suggestions you might have for us that we can pass back to our colleagues in leadership and in the Appropriations Committee to begin to try to get that balance. So thank you. I'll be quiet.
Let me just add one thing, and I didn't mention the possibility of going to the income tax reductions that Henry mentioned. And the reason I left that out is that certainly is a place you can go. You certainly can delay that, recoup some money to help alleviate the revenue sharing piece. However, that is one piece that the governor has apparently drawn a line in the sand. He's not going to go there. Now, whether or not his line in the sand will change as we get closer and closer to the end of the session, I don't know. But I think, at least he seems, from what I understand, willing to go look at a whole range of different things, but not about changing the tax structure that we settled in on in the last 2 years. So I didn't mention that, but Henry is absolutely right. I mean, that's one place we can go. And at the end of the day, when the legislature, the Appropriations Committee will devise a budget, and it will make everybody what I described as reasonably uncomfortable with that budget. We will craft some kind of a compromise, a consensus, but then, at the end of the day, it needs to go to the governor. If the governor isn't at least mildly amused by the budget, he will veto it, and then it will be up to the legislature to override his veto, and that's a hard thing to do, even given the numbers that we have. So, that's it for me.
Questions?
You talked about going after the tax changes that were made. You don't see this as just a one-year thing, do you? This revenue problem we have now? I mean, this isn't gonna be over at the end of this year, is it?
My opinion is that in order to get past this hump where we're always running in the hole, we need to control spending on health and human services, and we need to increase the business in this state so that there's more business, hiring more people, paying more taxes, and will help us fund the things that we need to fund, like education and roads and bridges. So the answer to your question is, no, I don't. I mean, if we push back the tax cuts another year or two, does that mean that they'll go in another year or two, everything gets better? I don't think so.
I mean, however we get there, the only long-term solution is growth in the economy, and we are still very much in the recession. Some really good signs out there in certain sectors, but we're still in the recession. And when the economy comes back, as it will, hopefully very robustly, but it'll come back to a certain extent, then those revenues will rise, and it will help deal with the problem data. But we gotta be, Bob says we gotta be thinking of the long term, and what can we do to make Maine more competitive compared to our sister states, and the tax cuts were certainly a big part of that effort.
Has there been any discussion, I'm sure there'll be lots of studies, comparing the effect of various tax maneuvers to, number one, make us more competitive with other states for both bringing people in to live and work, bringing companies in, between the income tax, which has been lowered for the 8 point down to 7.95, I think it is, which will affect a lot of people, because a lot of people in the state of Maine do pay part of their taxes on that highest rate. So there are a lot of people who will be affected by that. Increasing the sales tax by a penny, we've been there, and it was only during the times when we needed it. And I wouldn't even go to any other taxes right now, but those two taxes, if there is an increase in revenue, what would be the comparisons that you have done or are going to do as to how it affects competitiveness? What would the average savings or cost be doing a sales tax increase versus delaying the income tax decrease? They're both going to bring in a certain amount of revenue. How much does one bring in versus how much does the other? How much does a sales tax increase affect the Mainers versus the out-of-state people who will come in and spend lots of money, hopefully, and some of the tax will be gained through out-of-state people versus the income tax would only be in-state? And do they have the capabilities of saying that the average Mainer is going to save X number of dollars with an income tax decrease, they're going to actually pay X amount of dollars with a tax increase? So again, that's a pretty long question, and I'm sure you've thought those things, but I'm guessing, I'm hoping they'll do an analysis of that if they want to increase the revenue. What's going to be our biggest bang for the buck? Not going to diminish our image, not going to ruin our competitiveness, but raise monies that we need, in addition to the other side of the cut. So it's not really a question, but I guess I'd be interested in hearing those things once they're coming out.
The only thing I'd say is the whole area of which tax expenditures or raising the sales tax is bringing money in. The Better and Betty programs is paying money out with the idea of increasing investment and therefore increasing jobs. And your question's a perfect one. Well, how can we measure what works and doesn't work? And I guess having been here for 2 years myself, and both of these guys have been here longer, it's as much art as it is science, because it's hard to isolate just one thing and the impact of that one change in a world where there are 4,000 other things going on. And so the analysis needs to take place, but I don't think we can put a lot of stock in the answer. My dad used to be in the jewelry business, and he had to do a lot of advertising, and he always said that he knew he was wasting half of his advertising budget. He just couldn't figure out which half it was. And there's a little bit of that here, I'm trying to figure out. But I think one thing you just mentioned, who's paying the tax? Is it Mainers or is it out-of-staters? That's certainly something that I'll be talking about.
Is there a sentiment in the legislature that one of these is more productive as far as improving the state's condition than the other? The better tax, the excise on trucks, the other types of things. What's the sense right now? If you had to sort of decide, do you think the legislator would say, this is the one that's gonna give us the biggest bang for a buck with the least adverse effects? Or have they started really discussing that aspect yet?
I think there's a consensus that part of the tax cut package that lowers the rate on lower and middle income earners, that those should probably stay, and that raising those would be bad for the economy and bad for competitiveness. I think there's a commitment on that. There's disagreements about the inheritance tax, the governor's inheritance tax cut. There's differences of opinion about lodging and sales. Keep in mind that, a few years ago, you passed a really comprehensive tax reform package that heavily taxed out-of-staters and out-of-state activities and wasn't received well. So I don't think there's a lot of appetite for increasing the sales tax, if I had to guess.
The problem is that every time it's like a balloon, you poke it here and something bulges out here. With the sales tax, it doesn't seem like much if you went to 6 cents. I think a penny on the sales tax, I used to know, raises 120 million.
It's not just a
120 million.
penny, or it's not 1 cent, it's 1%.
1 cent, not one. Well, it's really a 20% increase, but if you go from 5 to 6 cents, so is that a big deal? Well, it may not be to people in Oakland so much. More so to people with less income than more, certainly. But the closer you get to the New Hampshire border, where there is no sales tax, the people who stop buying things from Maine merchants and go across the border, if you go from 5 to 6 cents, that swath of people who shop always in New Hampshire will go from maybe 40 miles wide to 60 miles wide. So the people along the border won't. As far as lodging tax is concerned, Maine's lodging tax is 7%. That's got to be the bargain. There are places that are 12, 15%. But the minute you talk about raising that tax, then you confront the fact that the hospitality industry will tell you, and I'm not going to give you the percentage, but the majority of people, because I don't remember the percentage, but the majority of people who stay at the Samoset, who spend a night in Portland, who go up north and spend a night in Millinocket or go out and eat and have some cocktails, the majority of those people are Mainers. So when you raise the rates to try to get the out-of-state people, you also get all of us who ever have slept in a motel room in the state or had a drink in a motel or a hotel. So the answer is there's no easy answer. So to Don's question, I don't know. Certainly we think about all those things, and that's where the discussions will come, and the work will be done in the Appropriations Committee. It'll go back to the 2 caucuses, see what we can get agreement on, some things that won't. Before, I don't remember whether sales tax went up 2 cents or 1 cent. It went up 1 cent, and we cut it in half, I believe, at one point of 5 and a half, and then we cut it down to 5.
7?
I think that's the way it went.
I thought we went up to 7 and then you cut it back.
I thought so too.
We went up to 7 and then.
7,
turned around
cut it to 6 and cut it
Year
to
or
5.
2 later and come back because we made up our revenue.
Right, the only reason it was cut, though, the legislature, once it starts to take the money, is reluctant to stop taking the money. But it was written into that bill that when the revenue got to a certain point, that the tax automatically was cut. And that was when Angus King was there, I think, and he didn't want it to cut, because it was thrown in his budget, but it was written into the law that way, and nobody changed the law.
Are you
So,
implying that legislatures have a tendency to spend more money if they get more? Is that what you're implying?
I'm telling you that as much as we get, we're able to spend it.
Unlike town councils.
Yeah, oh, no, no.
I did want to say, Mayor, I don't mean to sort of threaten or scare you, but if it's the sense of the town council that you want, if you support this package of tax cuts, if you want more competitiveness in the tax structure, it means less revenue, it means less revenue sharing. So I mean, that's something I hope you consider. I know you will, but it's something to think about.
How about the homestead exemption? The 80,000 we got in our budget, we're gonna get $80,000 more, because as I understand it, we share that. We put in half, the state puts in half, and that hits everybody in the town. So if you do in fact take the 80,000 away from Oakland that combines with our 80,000, that's gonna save the state $80,000, it's gonna save our town 80,000, but it's gonna create an extra tax bill for everybody in the town.
I think, isn't it capped, though? People below a certain,
I think it's elderly.
He's
or age, it's by
He's
age.
proposing to make it available for those 65 or
That's
older
right.
only.
Right, and I think what he's suggesting, Don, is eliminating it, but if you're over 65, actually doubling it. So if you're 64 like me, you don't do very well. Another year I would do great.
But theoretically, that would be a major, well, significant tax increase for every property owner in the town of Oakland, if that particular,
Sort of a silent, sneaky, yeah.
Under 65, yes.
A question I had, is there anything that would help you do your work that could come from the town council in the form of a vote or a motion or a statement of some kind, or any kind of a document that they could give you if they were to agree on something that would be useful as you try to make the votes in Augusta that you're gonna have to make?
I don't think there'd be anything wrong if the council has a suggestion or objects strenuously to something like revenue sharing, that if they put that in a letter and unanimously voted and send it to the legislators and copy the governor, or, sure, that's certainly something you can do. The caveat is every other community in the state of Maine is doing the same thing, so.
So is it worth the effort, or is it a waste of time?
I don't think it's a waste
I
of
don't
time.
think it's worth it.
No, I think it's worth the effort.
Is it fair to say you're concerned about the revenue sharing cut? Is that?
unfortunately, I think the alternatives also are
Concern.
that if you go into education, then the schools are going to have to raise more money, and they're gonna assess us more money to pay for the schools, so that's not really gonna change the tax structure. The Department of Human Services, yeah, that would, but again, how much can you cut when we have to do certain things that the federal government mandates and provide services to certain people? So, you know, same position, you catch 22, doesn't really matter which one you affect, it's going to create hardships. And I guess the hope is that we do the best job of reducing the hardships as we can. And I guess I would suggest, yeah, we write a letter of support to sort of share our concerns in the property tax issue for the towns. And we would have to probably cite several of these as being directly affecting major issues. And I think Bob's first comment, the effectiveness, efficiency of solutions